The economy is a really complex organism and it's changing all the time. And so shocks to the system can have unexpected consequences. So if you do something like the last Labor government removed the fringe benefit tax exemption for vehicles, that had implications for sales of cars, and they didn't like that. The car manufacturers, the new coalition government has reintroduced the benefits as a way of trying to boost the car industry, but that's another issue. So I want to just talk about a few ideas, and these are sort of the values of economists in general. But the old joke, ask two economists, you'll get 5 opinions. There's a whole range of economic views. And the thing about economics is that it is a way of thinking. So you can apply it, given your particular viewpoint that you start from, you can apply an economic model to the question that you're looking at, given the outcome that you want to achieve, whether it might be a sort of more egalitarian outcome or a more perhaps right-wing conservative outcome where the winners lose because they're the best, where the winners gain because they're the best, that sort of idea. So it was the 19th century British historian Thomas Carlyle who first coined the phrase the dismal science to refer to economics, and this was in his discussion of the West Indian slave trade at the time. And so I'm going to just quote a little bit from him because I think it's quite interesting that some of his ideas, which are now sort of 150 years old plus, are still what people feel about economists. So he argued that economics was dismal because it finds the secret of this universe in supply and demand and reducing the duty of human governors to that of letting people alone. So he wanted a more interventionist role for the government, and he was a conservative. He had a more deterministic view of people's place in the social order. If you were born as a slave, you felt you should stay as a slave. And some of that argument that he was using all that time ago is still used by people when they think about economics. So think of an example here of low pay for childcare workers and aged care workers. So you'll hear people say things like, they should be paid more. They make a real contribution to society. What they do is really valuable. So these words, should and ought, come into that sort of argument. But the economists will say, well, we've got supply and demand, and the reason why these people are not paid very well is that supply and demand is equilibrated at a lower wage. And it's not a moral, we're not making a moral judgment, we're just saying, well, that's the way it goes. And really, in a real discussion of the position of these workers, you need to get into a more sophisticated sort of argument where you look at the role of the government and the institutions in determining the pay that they receive. But still, at the core of it, you've got this supply and demand model working, and to say that they should be paid more is not the sort of way of an economist thinking about the question. That's just what they're paid. It's not a should and an ought sort of question. So those are the sorts of values that you get in economics, that we're thinking about markets working, we're thinking about governments intervening, and we're not thinking, well, the value of what this person produces is so high they should be paid a huge wage. So economic tools offer government a way of making policy, and though those decisions are not always easy to sell politically, and this is an example I'd use here is something like the future of the car industry in Australia. So an economist and the Productivity Commission, you can look at on their website, they've got lots of reports, they look at a whole lot of industries, and it's all good economic analysis. They say, well, what are the costs of closing the car industry? what are the benefits. And they might list in the costs things like people in Elizabeth in South Australia, in Broadmeadows, in Melbourne. They're all going to lose their jobs. All the people that work at Ford, people who work at General Motors, the people who work around them, so not those people who are directly employed in the industry, but people who are indirectly employed by the industry, so the automotive part workers, the people that supply retail services in those areas are all going to be affected by what happens to the car industry. So those are big costs. We're going to create some unemployment, and we're going to create, given that we've got a welfare state, we're going to create people collecting unemployment benefits. We're going to create people perhaps retiring early and getting disability pensions and things like that. The benefit of closing the car industry is that most Australians will perhaps be able to buy a cheaper car, and they won't, because there's a small tariff imposed on cars, and they won't be, the taxes that were paid that were to support some of the industry programs for the car industry will not be used for those purposes anymore. And once again, we can think there of the idea of opportunity cost. Instead of some program which was designed to support the car industry, we might now have another hospital. So there's an opportunity cost involved. Those are going to be the beneficiaries. But the people who are bearing the costs are concentrated geographically, and they bear substantial costs. The people who benefit from it are dispersed there throughout the whole of Australia, and it might only make a small difference. You know, they might only be a little bit better off by the demise of the car industry. So you've then got the politicians trying to weigh up these costs and benefits, and if we're talking about marginal electorates and things like that, then the politicians are going to respond very strongly to the groups that are concentrated in particular areas. But the economist's job is not really to make the final decision, it's to get together all the evidence. Well, what is the evidence on the costs and the benefits of continuing to support the car industry or deciding to get rid of the car industry? These are, it might also be a different result in the short run and the long run. Today I might lose my job as working for General Motors, but next week I might get an even bigger and better job, engineer let's say I'm an engineer, I might go off and get a job with some sort of highly paid mining firm or whatever, and I might be better off. So we've got to look at what happens in the short run and what happens in the long run.